I drove down the long, empty highway, the headlights of my truck cutting through the dense fog that clung to the road like a second skin. The GPS said I was close, but there wasn't much around, just the occasional silhouette of towering pines and the faint hum of electrical wires overhead. When I finally saw the structure ahead, my stomach tightened. The usina looked more like a fortress than a power plant. Thick concrete walls surrounded the main facility, and enormous smokestacks rose like watchful sentinels into the night sky, spewing faint trails of smoke. The sign at the gate was faded and rusted, the words barely legible. Ash Grove Power Plant. I parked my truck in the desolate lot and stepped out, the crisp air biting at my skin. The place was eerily quiet, save for the occasional hiss of steam and the low mechanical rumble coming from within. I adjusted my jacket and walked toward the main door, my boots crunching against the gravel. Inside, the lighting was dim, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The faint smell of oil and ozone filled the air. As I approached the control room, a figure emerged from the dim hallway. "You Mike?" The man's voice was gravelly, and his eyes were sharp beneath bushy gray brows. He extended a hand that felt like sandpaper when I shook it. "Yeah, that's me," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Hank," he said simply. "I'm the night supervisor. Been here for 30 years. Let me give you the rundown." He led me into the control room, a cramped space filled with monitors, switches, and blinking lights. It felt like stepping into a relic of the past, with everything coated in a thin layer of dust. Hank motioned for me to sit in the chair, then handed me a single sheet of paper. "These are the rules," he said, his tone flat. I looked at the paper. The list was short, only 5 or 6 items, but something about it made my skin crawl. The wording was strange, almost cryptic. 1. Never turn off the red light on the main panel. 2. Do not look at camera 7 between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. 3. If you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around. 4. At exactly 2:15 a.m., tune the radio to frequency 107.9 and wait for 2 minutes. 5. Do not leave the control room unless the alarm sounds 5 times in succession. I frowned, glancing up at Hank. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" Hank's face darkened. "Listen, kid, this isn't a joke. Follow these rules exactly as they're written, and you'll get through the night just fine. Don't follow them. Well, you don't want to know what happens if you don't." I wanted to press him for details, but the look in his eyes silenced me. He was dead serious. Hank glanced at the clock on the wall. "I gotta head out. You're on your own from here. Don't screw this up." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the silent, flickering room with nothing but the hum of the equipment and the list of rules clutched in my hand. I stared at the paper in my hands, rereading the rules over and over. Each time, they made less sense, but they also unsettled me more. What kind of power plant operated under these conditions? What could possibly happen if I didn't follow some arbitrary set of instructions? The room around me was dimly lit, with only the glow of the monitors and the faint red light on the main panel breaking the darkness. That damn red light. It was there, steady and constant, like it was watching me. I leaned back in the old creaky chair and started going over the rules again in my head. Rule 1. The red light. Simple enough. Leave it alone. But why would anyone want to turn it off? Rule 2. The camera. I glanced at the monitor labeled CAM7. It showed a narrow, poorly lit hallway deep in the plant. Nothing moved, and yet something about it felt wrong. Rule 3. Footsteps. I laughed under my breath, trying to shake off the tension. Don't turn around. I muttered to myself. What kind of horror movie crap was this? Rule 4. The radio. I glanced at the old unit sitting on the desk. Dusty, like it hadn't been touched in years. Rule 5. The alarm. This one seemed logical enough, though the specificity of 5 times in succession made me uneasy. I checked my watch. It was just past 11 p.m. A full night stretched ahead of me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I was alone in the control room. For a while, I busied myself by flipping through the plant's manual, trying to learn the basics of the equipment. But I kept coming back to the rules, my eyes drifting to the red light, the camera, and the radio. A few hours passed uneventfully, though every little noise seemed louder in the silence. The distant hum of machinery, the occasional clang of metal echoing through the building. I told myself it was just the old equipment doing its thing, but it didn't make me feel any better. Then, at 2:10 a.m., I remembered Rule 4. I reached for the radio and turned it on, the static filling the room like a hiss of whispers. My hand hovered over the dial until I found 107.9. The static cut out, replaced by silence. I waited. 1 minute, 2. Nothing happened. I let out a shaky breath and leaned back in my chair. Maybe Hank was just messing with me. Or maybe these rules were just to keep me on edge, part of some twisted hazing ritual for new guys. But as soon as the thought crossed my mind, the static returned. And this time, it wasn't random. A faint, rhythmic tapping came through the speaker, like fingers drumming on wood. Then, a voice. Low and guttural, barely audible over the static. It said, my name. Mike. The voice froze me in place. My heart raced, and I stared at the radio like it might bite me. I leaned closer, holding my breath, trying to convince myself I'd misheard. Mike, the voice said again, clearer this time. It sounded like someone standing right next to me, whispering directly into my ear. I yanked the power knob on the radio, shutting it off. The silence that followed was deafening, but at least the voice was gone. I sat back, trying to steady my breathing, convincing myself it was just interference or my mind playing tricks on me. But as soon as I started to relax, I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, distant, like someone walking on metal grates far down the hall. I turned toward the door instinctively, but the memory of Rule 3 stopped me cold. If you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around. My muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at me to look, but I didn't. I stayed frozen in my chair, gripping the armrests like my life depended on it. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside the door to the control room. I stared straight ahead, refusing to turn my head, even as a shadow appeared in the narrow window of the door. It was faint, almost imperceptible in the dim light, but it was there, something tall, impossibly tall, standing perfectly still. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. The door didn't open. The footsteps didn't continue. The silence returned, heavier than ever. I exhaled shakily, my hands trembling. My eyes darted to the clock on the wall. 3:05 a.m. My gaze shifted to the monitors, and that's when I made my mistake. I looked at camera 7. The screen showed the same empty hallway as before, the shadows long and distorted by the flickering lights. But something was different. A figure stood at the far end of the hall, barely visible in the dim light. Its shape was wrong, too thin, too elongated, and it didn't move. It just stood there, facing the camera, as though it knew I was watching. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were glued to the screen, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Then it moved, not like a person walking, but in sudden, jerky motions, like it was skipping frames in a video. 1 second, It was at the far end of the hall. The next, it was halfway closer. Then, closer still. I slammed my hand on the power button, killing the feed. My reflection stared back at me in the now dark monitor, pale and wide-eyed. The lights in the room flickered violently, and the low hum of the machinery grew louder, almost deafening. My chest tightened as the temperature in the room dropped, my breath visible in the cold air. The radio crackled back to life on its own, spewing static and distorted whispers. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The light stabilized, the room warmed, and the silence returned. I sat there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, my mind replaying the rules over and over again. I'd broken one, and now, something knew I was here. The room felt wrong, off, like the air itself was heavier. I stayed glued to my chair, gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles turned white. My eyes darted to the clock. 3:15 a.m. The rest of the night stretched ahead like an eternity. Breaking one rule had caused this. The whisper on the radio, the shadow at the door, the figure on camera 7, they weren't coincidences. Something in this place wasn't just watching me, it was testing me. I tried to focus on the monitors, pretending everything was normal. But the harder I tried, the more the silence pressed against me. The distant hum of the plant's machinery was no longer a comfort. It felt like a pulse, alive and deliberate. And then, the first failure happened. A sharp alarm pierced the air, jolting me out of my daze. One of the monitors flashed red, displaying an error in turbine 3. I scrambled to the keyboard, pulling up the diagnostics. It didn't make sense. Turbine 3 was offline, but the system reported a power surge, a violent, unnatural spike that shouldn't have been possible. The lights overhead flickered, and the ground beneath me vibrated slightly, like something was waking up. I reached for the phone to call Hank, but the line was dead. Of course it was. I slammed the receiver down, my frustration mixing with fear. "Think, Mike," I muttered under my breath. "What's the procedure?" I pulled out the plant's emergency manual, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. My eyes scanned the text, looking for answers, but none of it matched what I was seeing. It was like the system was breaking rules of its own. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they didn't come from the hallway. They came from the ceiling. Slow, deliberate thuds, like heavy boots walking on the metal grating above me. I stared at the ceiling, sweat trickling down my face. My instinct screamed to run, to leave the control room and never look back. But Rule 5 stopped me cold. Do not leave the control room, unless the alarm sounds 5 times in succession. I clenched my fists, trying to block out the sound. The footsteps grew louder, circling directly above me. Then they stopped. The room went deathly silent again, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, it was over. But the monitors began to glitch, the screens flickering between static and distorted images of the plant's interior. And there, in the corner of one monitor, I saw it. The figure from camera 7. It was in the turbine room now, hunched and unnatural, its limbs bent at impossible angles. It wasn't moving, but its head turned sharply toward the camera, as though it knew I was watching. The error on the screen cleared itself, the alarm stopped, and the monitor stabilized. But I knew this wasn't over. I hadn't fixed anything. Whatever was inside this plant wasn't just causing the malfunctions. It was testing how far it could go, and how much I could take. The room settled into a tense quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every nerve in my body was on edge, but I couldn't just sit there waiting for the next incident. I opened the plant's main system logs, hoping to find some explanation for the errors. At first, the data looked normal. Routine maintenance reports, power outputs, nothing unusual. But the deeper I dug, the more anomalies I found. There were unexplained spikes in energy consumption during the night shifts, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Equipment would malfunction without cause, only to fix itself minutes later. Operators had reported strange sightings in the logs, brief, cryptic notes like shadow in turbine 3 or heard voices in the hallways. And then there were the disappearances. Buried in an old file marked incidents was a list of names. Operators who had worked the night shift over the years. Most had left the plant abruptly, their departures filed under vague reasons like personal leave or no contact. But a handful of names had no explanation at all. No resignation, no forwarding address. Just gone. My name was at the bottom of the list, recently added, with today's date beside it. A chill ran down my spine. I pushed back from the desk and stood, pacing the small room. My mind raced with questions. Who, or what, was behind all this? What was the point of the rules, and why did breaking them seem to provoke something? I thought about Hank. He'd worked here for decades, which meant he had to know more than he let on. Maybe he was trying to protect me, or maybe he was part of whatever this was. Either way, I needed answers. That's when I remembered the desk in the corner. Hank had been sitting there earlier, and I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, it felt like a lead. I rummaged through the drawers, finding nothing but old tools and plant schematics. Then, in the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a pile of papers, I found a small, leather-bound notebook. The first page was labeled Operator's Log. I flipped through it, my hands trembling. The entries were written in shaky handwriting, and each one painted a picture of paranoia and fear. The rules aren't just rules. They're a barrier. If you break them, you let it in. It's not just one thing. It's the plant itself. The machinery keeps it trapped, but it's always testing, looking for weak spots. They told me this place was built on cursed ground, some kind of old ritual site. They thought they could control it with technology. They were wrong. The last entry stopped me cold. If you're reading this, you've probably already broken a rule. I'm sorry, there's no way out now. I dropped the notebook, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. None of this made sense, but at the same time, it explained everything. The malfunctions, the rules, the shadow, in camera 7. It wasn't just my imagination. The plant was more than a power station. It was a prison, and whatever it was, holding back, wanted out. A low creak echoed from the hallway, pulling me out of my thoughts. My eyes darted to the door. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. A presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing against the thin walls of the control room. I picked up the notebook, clutching it like a lifeline, and backed away toward the desk. My mind raced, trying to decide what to do next. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were rituals. A delicate balance keeping something contained, and I had broken one. I couldn't sit there any longer, waiting for whatever was out in the hallway to make its move. If anyone had answers, it was Hank. He'd been here for decades. He had to know what was really going on. I grabbed the radio, half expecting it to spark to life with static or whispers, but the line stayed silent. "Hank," I said, my voice trembling, "if you're listening, I need help. Something's wrong with the plant. Something's really wrong." No response. I tried again, louder this time, almost yelling into the receiver. "Hank! Damn it! Answer me!" A burst of static filled the room, followed by Hank's voice, low and gruff, but laced with urgency. "Mike, what the hell's going on? Did you break a rule?" The way he asked it, like he already knew the answer, made my stomach twist. "Yeah," I admitted, pacing the room. I looked at camera 7. But there's something else going on here, Hank. The alarms. The shadows. This isn't just a power plant, is it? For a long moment, there was only static. Then Hank sighed, a sound that carried years of regret. Kid, you weren't supposed to know any of this. You were supposed to follow the rules and keep your head down. That's not an answer, I snapped. What's happening here? Why do we need these rules? What is this place? Hank's voice softened, but it didn't make what he said any less chilling. This plant was built on cursed land, Mike. Long before the town, long before any of us were around, something evil was buried here. The company thought they could harness it, use the energy to power the grid, but they didn't realize what they were dealing with. What is it? I asked, gripping the radio so hard my knuckles ached. Hank hesitated. I don't know exactly. A force? A presence? Something ancient. The rules are all that keep it locked up. Break them, even one, and you weaken the barrier. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I glanced at the red light on the panel, still glowing steadily, as though mocking me. So, what happens now? You need to fix it, Hank said. You need to restore the balance before it breaks free completely. How? I demanded, my voice rising in panic. How do I fix it? Hank didn't answer. Hank? The static returned, louder now, drowning out his voice. Then I heard something else. A deep, guttural growl, like the sound of metal grinding against itself. The radio cut out, and the lights in the control room flickered again. I was alone. My chest tightened as I realized Hank wasn't coming to help. Whatever I was dealing with, I'd have to face it on my own. The control room seemed to close in around me, the walls shrinking as the air grew colder. I clenched my fists, my breath coming in shallow gasps. If Hank was right, the thing I'd seen, the shadow on camera 7, the presence that stalked the hallways, was no hallucination, and it was getting stronger. The low hum of the plant's machinery became erratic, like a heartbeat speeding up. I checked the monitors, desperate for a clue. Most of the cameras showed static, but camera 3 flickered to life, revealing the turbine room. It was there. The figure stood in the center of the room, its elongated form hunched and wrong. The shadows around it twisted unnaturally, as if the light itself couldn't decide where to fall. Its head snapped upward, as though it sensed me watching, and the camera feed cut to black. The alarms blared again, a deafening wail that rattled the windows. My mind raced. Hank had said I needed to restore the balance, but he hadn't explained how. I grabbed the notebook I'd found earlier, flipping through its pages in a frenzy. One phrase jumped out at me. The red light is the anchor. If it falters, the seal breaks. I turned toward the panel. The red light still glowed, steady and unblinking. For now. The alarms changed. 1, 2, 3. They stopped. My heart sank. 4. A pause. Then the 5th. The sound hit like a sledgehammer. Rule 5. Do not leave the control room unless the alarm sounds 5 times in succession. The rules hadn't failed me yet. I hesitated for a moment longer, then grabbed a flashlight and the notebook, shoving the door open. The hallway outside was darker than it should have been. The overhead lights flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows. The air was thick, heavy, like wading through water. I made my way toward the turbine room, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. As I rounded the corner, a low growl echoed down the corridor. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the beam. The door to the turbine room loomed ahead, half open and spilling faint, unnatural light into the hall. I pushed it open, the metal creaking loudly. Inside, the air was colder than ever, and the figure stood at the far end of the room, its back to me. The shadows around it writhed, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the erratic hum of the machinery. It turned slowly, its face, or what should have been a face, hidden behind a shifting void of darkness. My knees nearly buckled as a wave of dread washed over me. The notebook slipped from my hands, and I dropped to my knees, gripping the floor to steady myself. The figure began to move toward me, its steps jerky and unnatural, each one sending vibrations through the metal grates beneath us. My eyes darted to the red light mounted on the wall, now dim and flickering. I had to fix it, somehow. The dim flicker of the red light was like a countdown, its once steady glow now sputtering weakly, threatening to extinguish completely. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle in my body trembling. The figure stopped its jerky approach, standing still as if it was daring me to act. The notebook lay open on the floor, the pages fluttering in the unnatural wind that filled the turbine room. My eyes landed on one line, underlined in thick, desperate strokes. The anchor must be reignited, no matter the cost. No matter the cost. I stumbled toward the red light on the wall, barely able to think over the rising hum of the machinery and the oppressive weight of the entity's presence. The control panel beneath the light was old, covered in dust and grime, with switches and levers that seemed almost alien in design. The figure moved again, faster this time. The shadows around it stretched, reaching for me like living tendrils. I grabbed a lever on the panel and pulled, hoping, praying that it would do something. The light flared for a moment, bright and steady, before sputtering back to near darkness. "It's not enough!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. I slammed my fists against the panel, my mind racing. The notebook had said the red light was the anchor, but it wasn't just the machinery that powered it. It was the operator. Hank's words echoed in my mind. Restore the balance. I understood now. It wasn't about fixing the system. It was about offering something in return for breaking the rules. The figure was almost upon me, its shadowy limbs stretching across the floor. I turned to face the panel one last time. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to. Hank, myself, or whatever force was trapped here. I gripped the lever again and pushed it upward with all my strength. A surge of energy shot through the room, blinding light filling the space as the red light blazed back to life. The figure let out a deafening screech, its form dissolving into the light. The machinery roared, shaking the walls, and I felt the ground beneath me give way. The last thing I saw was the red light, steady and unwavering, as darkness consumed me. I woke up to silence. The deafening hum of the machinery, the screech of the entity, the trembling of the ground. It was all gone. My body ached, every muscle sore, as if I'd been hit by a truck. The cold metal floor beneath me was reassuringly solid, though my head throbbed with the remnants of whatever had happened. I sat up slowly, blinking against the harsh light of the turbine room. The red light on the panel glowed steadily now, unwavering, as if nothing had ever been wrong. The air was warm again, the oppressive chill a distant memory. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I had imagined it all, but then I looked around. The turbine room was in disarray. The grates were bent and warped, as though something massive had pressed against them. The shadows on the walls seemed darker, more defined, as if they had soaked up the residual energy of what had just happened. And then there was the notebook. It lay open on the floor near the control panel, its pages blackened at the edges as though it had been too close to a fire. I picked it up, flipping to the last entry. There, scrawled in handwriting that wasn't mine, were 3 words: "It is contained." I staggered back to the control room, my legs weak but steady enough to carry me. The monitors buzzed to life as I entered, displaying the usual feeds of empty hallways and humming machinery. Camera 7 showed nothing unusual, just a dark corridor with no sign of the figure or its shadows. I slumped into the chair, staring at the screens, letting the reality of what had just happened wash over me. The rules had worked. I didn't understand how or why, but they had done their job. The balance was restored. For now. As my breathing slowed, I noticed something new on the desk. A folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. With trembling hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was Hank's, rough and hurried. "You did good, kid. Not many make it through their first night. But remember, the plant always needs someone to keep the balance. You're part of this now. There's no leaving." My chest tightened as the weight of his words sank in. I glanced at the list of rules, still taped to the console. They weren't just guidelines. They were a contract, and I was bound to them. Out of habit, I checked the personnel log on the main monitor. My name was there, bold and unmissable, with a new note beside it. Indefinite assignment. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the red light on the wall. It pulsed softly, almost reassuringly, as if to remind me of my place. The alarms were quiet now, the machinery steady, but deep down, I knew the quiet wouldn't last forever. The balance was fragile, and I was its keeper. Outside, the sun was starting to rise, painting the horizon in shades of orange and red, but inside the plant, time didn't matter. I wasn't going anywhere.